All right, welcome everybody to as usual, much belated edition of Rugby Matrix America. I'm Alex Goff, and I'm Happy New Year to everybody. I hope you had a good holiday, and especially to our guest, USA Rugby CEO Ross Young. Happy New Year, and hope you had a good holiday. And how are you doing?
Happy New Year, Alex, and happy New Year to all the listeners and viewers. Yeah, it was a well-needed break. I think as always, it's never enough, and you continue to
Mm.
have to tinker around with stuff. But considering the ongoing issues we're all having to deal with, it was certainly nice to have some quality family time.
Okay, yeah. Well, the end of the year is a kind of a nerve-wracking time, generally financially speaking, and in terms of running a business or an organization. Was it a key time for USA Rugby?
Yeah, I mean every end of month seems to have been for the last couple of years. But I mean, as everyone's aware, we've just had to knuckle down, and as always, we're still never we didn't we never really got back up to like every community or rugby stakeholder. This year's been a little bit hand to mouth. You know, as we said, we've been extra vigilant on every dollar that we spend. We're still a little bit short-handed staff-wise because committing to a number of the initiatives that we wanted to would have needed us to bring more staff in, and I want to make sure we get ahead of the game with all these things. So I want to make sure we've got money in the bank and security before we start kicking on in some of those. So it's really been trying to keep the head above water, do all the mandatory requirements, do what we need to do, and when actually we ended up better than we expected to be at the end of year results. It's not great, but we've got a little bit of a cushion in the bank to take us to the new year, and hopefully as we do get back to a little bit more of playing rugby and normality, we can pick up on some of those projects.
You you obviously don't want to be in the position of spending money you're expecting to get in a few months, especially considering with the advent of COVID, that made predicting whatever who would be registering and things like that. It's just you can't predict it. So I guess it's certainly a good thing that you would have a surplus, even if it's a small amount.
Yeah, no, and it's fair play to all the staff and board members. We've all been kicking in and ensuring that we don't get ahead of ourselves and try to run before we can rewalk. It's all about relearning all of those simple basics.
Fair enough. The how important was I don't want to use the word lifeline, but the assistance. How important was the assistance from the City of Glendale?
I think Vendale have been great. We've it, it, again that the the benefit of that agreement is giving us structure and keeping costs down, and allowing us to put events on. With without too much outlay and upfront. So a huge kudos to Mayor Mike and Linda for continuing to help and we're looking forward to continue to build that. I think we'd have liked to have even more events, but certainly during this last year, it was great to have the facilities here, not just for games, but for training camps and giving the national teams and some of the pathway programs the opportunity to have a daily training environment during this last year.
And office space too.
Yeah,
Yeah,
the office agreement was literally for a year, so
yeah, yeah.
that's sort of gone back to more of a norm. But it's certainly that finished sort of halfway through last year. But and again, that just helps us get back to our own 2 feet and look at realistic costs.
Uh, um, where are you financially? Where is the organization financially now in terms of you've got bills to pay, you've got people to pay back, and as you said, you said you got a bit of a surplus, but you're running a pretty lean ship right now. So
Yeah, no, we're good, and we've gone through that. As again, most people are aware, that financial exercise. I think we talked about it last time we spoke. Of being very clear that it's not just accounting purposes of how an Excel spreadsheet looks. That you know previously, by the nature of the business, and I think we're all aware of the history behind it. It's complicated. We were almost a banker stroke clearinghouse for a number of stakeholders previously, and when there's monies coming in and flowing out the way they were, keeping an up-to-date track of exactly where you were from day to day was incredibly difficult. It was a complex, very complex way we accounted. What we've done is we've separated, not just the Excel spreadsheets, as I said, but physical bank accounts as well, and made sure that we don't get tempted from, even if it's in the high performance area, using a little bit of money from the men's 15s program to help the women's 15s, knowing that gets paid back. We've been very strict in ensuring that if the cash is not in that particular account, it doesn't get spent. And that goes through all the way. The accounts have been split out from training and education, development, commercial, national teams, national office, and it's hopefully, as we said, that's been one of the benefits of taking the time and doing what we're doing, is that there's very clear, almost a much more cash flow influenced budget, rather than running an accounting system and reconciling things up that the way it was done previously used to take a couple of months for the stuff to get to the surface, because there was cash in the bank, but it was all merged money, as we know, and I think that continues to give us a good foundation, and we'll make sure we stick with all those moving forward.
good. Were you in a position at some point where you had to tell a national team or a high performance group, stop that, or you can't do that, right?
No, and it's not just that goes for all the different pots, if you like. It was what we've tried to do, and we continue to try to do, is build a very base budget on what would be a minimum, with literally projects almost on standby until you've got the cash there to go. So instead of retrospectively, as you said, say, whoa, stop, is get the planning process done, so that based on USOPC funding, based on World Rugby funding, is ensure that those the individual projects were managed in such a way that, right, now we can start planning for this. Yes, the money's there, so we're rather getting ahead of it, rather than get everyone excited about something happening and then say stop. Is everyone knows that the layers that sit above the base level, so are conditional on us hitting where we need to get to with regard to cash.
Good. Under promise, over deliver, ideally, rather than the other way around. And the thing about in my experience with USA Rugby, American Rugby, is especially most national team coaches, almost all of them, probably a little bit more the ones that come from countries where they have higher budgets, complain about money, and so I mean, so it's kind of a standard thing. I would imagine you or your office is fielding sort of this ongoing requests or demands, a little bit of pushback from head coaches and things, saying we need to do this, we need to do it. And you're like, we can't do that right now. No, that's the contingency. We're waiting to see if we have the budget.
Yeah, and listen, having gone through what we've gone to with a number of staff in the high performance areas, well, everyone took large pay cuts, but also a number of them were furloughed altogether, that were brought back gradually during last year. So I think they've all lived through the reality of it. Obviously, Emily's moved into that coaching position from a administrative oversight. So, she understands, Mike and as does Rob in the women's area. And obviously Mike and Gary went through that with us all last year. So I think everyone's cognizant of the need to do it. But as you said, it's always an environment whereby everyone wants to do a little bit more, because it does make a difference.
Yep. Yep. All right. As we stay with the national teams for a little bit, I think it'd be fair to say a bit of rough year especially for the 15s teams. Some good notes. I mean, the positive for the women's national team was getting on the field, but to end the year with the drubbing by England has got to hurt, and the men had their moments, but they got beat hugely by New Zealand, and then didn't qualify, didn't win the qualification series with Uruguay. So what's going on there? I mean, how do you feel about it?
Yeah, there's no point sugarcoating it. Everyone is disappointed, not least the coaching and playing staff. If you look at what we've done and what we've tried to achieve over the last year, obviously one of our main initiatives was to get the women back on the field playing meaningful games, and for the men to directly qualify at the first attempt. It's also worth a shout out when we talk about the national teams about how great it's been having Dan Payne back in overseeing the programs. As we try to rebuild things, from a couple of years ago, not having anyone in that direct oversight area was undoubtedly made everyone's life more difficult. And Dan's done a great job, but Dan's remit and going through that process with Dan was around building for the future and almost future what we're trying to do with all the teams, and put a new focus on pathways and development, and getting the overall standard of the players that are sitting there in the pipeline higher, getting them all playing more. And I think massively disappointed for everyone, but we didn't have any luck at all last year. And when you look at, and that's not an excuse, but when you look at COVID impacted issues in getting teams together, it's great to have teams training, but having all the players there. So all the domestic, we wanted, if you look at the women's team to start with, there are now 15, 16 women playing in the Alliance Premiership, which is great from a daily perspective, exposing them to it. But a number of the camps that we had here for the domestic players didn't have those overseas players playing. And then you look at how when the team came together and tried to play, they tried to play an expansive open game, and we copped injuries. I mean, losing Gabby Katona when we were really on the up against Canada, and Canada being number 3 in the world, we asked a bunch of questions of Canada and could have and should have won both of those games. And you lose Gabby, then you lose Rachel Johnson in the Ireland game, and you just look a bit of cohesion for some of those key players, and it wasn't for the want of a lack of effort, but it's having those players playing together in meaningful matches consistently, together as units, and having and doing that, having people come in, and you look at Megan Foster, who did a great job, and she steered the ship for Exeter for a huge win this last weekend. I mean, we've got, AJ has, who we missed, obviously we missed, but we can't put too much weight on AJ's shoulders. But he's, man of the match performance. We missed Paula CK. We went into those games at Uruguay missing 7 or 8 of what would be top line players, and we just don't, don't have that team playing together enough. And it's you look at where the team ended up against England. You know, for the women, it was a game too far, having tried to do too much, but you couldn't say there wasn't effort on the field. I think the frustrating, difficult, but we have to pick up and improve from that. And to be honest, that on my perspective and the coach's perspective, at least we got some games. And I always think when you look at from a men and a women's perspective, to me, one of the biggest things was unless you're playing regular games and you look at the English women team who've been on a phenomenal run, didn't miss a beat during COVID, and they played the women's Six Nations. They played something like 12 internationals during that period, and they take on the Black Ferns, who, and it 250-point victories. That Black Ferns team doesn't all of a sudden, they just haven't been playing, and neither of our crew been playing together, and you've just got to try and take that into account as well. And this year for us is massively important all round to ensure that we do continue to get games, and obviously building towards Chile in July is going to be huge for the men's team.
I a lot of times I get into conversation with different people around the world. What are some of the obstacles, things like that? You have athletes, and say, well, look, even if all the best players were in the United States, the country is massive. You can't just say, look, you're going to play a Friday or a Saturday game, and then on Sunday, can we all meet somewhere and just do some run-throughs? You can't do that, right? You can do that in a small country. You can even do that in France because it's a square, essentially, and it's not that hard to get to the FFR facility outside of Paris if they wanted to do that. But we add to that we've got, as you said, players overseas. So we have that problem, and I don't think that problem's ever going away. What can we do? What can you do, you, plural, USA Rugby do, knowing that problem's never going to go away?
I think the most important thing is setting the structure and framework. And again, I've mentioned it a couple of times at various different outlets, Alex, but is using the windows correctly and using the opportunity to get teams together. So, pre-COVID, again, if you look at the men's and women's 15s team as a point of difference, and I mean, we can come on to the sevens in a minute because, a lot of what happened in the sevens program allowed us a more equal playing field that allows both those teams to be competing at a higher level. But if you look at 15s, as you quite rightly point out, it's a different environment altogether. And we'd started planning. There'd been the creation of this Pac-4 tournament to almost compete against the Six Nations for the Northern Hemisphere. So to get Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and the US women playing in a regular tournament that would, mirror what happens in the Rugby Championship. So you're creating another tournament that creates those release mechanisms that has World Rugby specific funding because it's a World Rugby tournament. The ARC had been building into a decent tournament that was supposed to move to a more Southern Hemisphere window in that September period that would have to have us redesignating currently for player release and for international release windows. The US, which is structured as a Northern Hemisphere union. So technically, our release windows are around the same time as the Six Nations, not the Rugby Championship. And then, of course, you get the July and November windows. So we, in working with World Rugby, we'd look to move the ARC, build that into a tournament that aligns us more with the Southern Hemisphere, and almost at some point develop that into a promotion relegation from the first tier of the Rugby Championship that gets all those players together because they're playing in that environment. And you can then talk about working with Australia and New Zealand, and instead of players playing in Europe, maybe they play more in the Southern Hemisphere with some of those Super Rugby franchises. And that's all big picture, but we've now got to get back and look at that. The Pac-4 never got off the ground, as we know, because of because of COVID and especially the extra restrictions in Australia and New Zealand, the ARC pretty much got abandoned. We've started having discussions how we can reignite that with some Pacific Island influence, so that to make it a proper, talk about Japan, Fiji, who of them are going to get added to the first tier of the Rugby Championship. So I think structure is the most important thing, Alex, in the long-winded way of answering that for the 15s programs, to have regular windows, regular games, regular opportunity to play teams above you and below you instead of ad hoc fixtures. And, that's something we continue to address. It's something that World Rugby recognise has to improve and has to be better if there's going to be a more even playing field and more competitive nations, for which I'm sure we'll come on to discussing for World Cup.
World Rugby has tried. They've tried this. So I don't want to say World Rugby isn't cognizant of it, but it's so frustrating to see things that haven't hung on, right? It's 2, 3, 4 years, then it changes, or then it disappears.
And I think that's a fair comment, but those were ad hoc invitational tournaments that didn't have buy-in from the other competitive competitions, if you like. And I think to me that's the key step, is when you look at, and we have to be more aggressive in how we position ourselves. And everyone talks about the opportunities of the American media market from a global perspective. But that's never going to get triggered unless the US are successful. And ad hoc invitational games, and as you said, be it Churchill Cups, be it Pacific Rims, be it all those things, they were standalone, which, doesn't give you the same benefit as being part of a competition structure that includes New Zealand, Australia, South Africa, Japan, Fiji, that that allows movement and allows you to build your way up the ladder by playing.
So you're looking. I'm sorry. You're looking at a second division rugby championship.
Something. I think those are all the sort of things that we have to discuss, and I think and with promotion and relegation, and I think that has to happen in Europe at some point as well. But it's the only way you're going to open up, beyond, and that you can change designation of tier 1, tier 2, developing, developed nations, whichever terminology you want to use. Ultimately, you want a bigger pot of teams that are genuinely competitive, and you only do that by playing regular games of teams at the same standard around you, but obviously regular games, meaningful games, not just friendlies, against teams that are up in that top 10. And the 6 nations and the 4 teams that play in the Rugby Championship make up that top 10. If those are always going to be insulated and nobody else is allowed in there for the number of games that they play, you're never going to open up. So I think there is much better understanding now, with everyone having been squeezed over the last couple of years, of taking this opportunity to build for the future and put structure in to allow that to happen in such a way that does give the opportunity of those technically developing nations to hit the top tier.
So how do you feel then about the Ireland game that didn't happen, or the New Zealand game that did, especially because they were outside the test window, so USA couldn't get their international, which has happened before. We're playing the best team in the world without 7, 8, 9 players who can't be made available because they're overseas players. Is that something we shouldn't have?
But again, you've got to take your opportunities when you can get them, Alex. And when those 2 games were talked about conceptually, obviously everyone thought the world would be back in a better COVID place. The position that the New Zealanders were taking is that when we were having the initial discussions, there was going to be a much bigger squad, that were going to come up, because they were also playing Wales outside the window, and then having those other test matches have the opportunity to mix and match more developing players, get people. Of course, COVID didn't go away as we all hoped it would have done. Ireland, with additional issues and restrictions, with the risk analysis of, because they were just coming to the US for a week, and then bearing in mind they hadn't had the opportunity to play in front of crowds, which England had, New Zealand had, even within the closed door environment, is Ireland had gone through various different lockdowns. The first revenue generating opportunity by having crowds at the Aviva Stadium. The risk of something going wrong with that squad coming over here for a one-off game that would have impacted, them. They just, the risk was too great for them. So, they pulled the pin on it, and and I can understand that. New Zealand, ended up leaving New Zealand, being in lockdown and being frustrated for nearly 3 weeks in Queensland before they came up here. They weren't allowed to add those, or they didn't bring the bigger squads. So you end up with a very hungry, frustrated All Blacks team with Mackenzie, Moanga, a bunch of those guys that hadn't even played in the Rugby Championship out to prove a point. And, even the emotional issues they had in dealing with a tragic death the week before and dedicating that game of open rugby. So from an initial concept of playing a team that was potentially going to be more of a mix and match side against, we were hoping to get a couple of players, but injuries didn't work out. The change to a very top string team. I mean, they kicked the ball twice in that game. When's the last game of international rugby? Because they almost wanted to make it barbarian style tribute type rugby against a team that had never seen anything like that before. It was just, again, a number of circumstances that just made that an incredibly tough game for us.
Okay. The other part of my thought, what you were talking about in terms of shifting the competition is, I'm old, you're old. We remember tours. Rugby tours are a great thing, right? The British and Irish Lions tour is a big event. We saw what happened when fans didn't go. It's just not as much fun even to watch on television because the fans couldn't follow them. And international rugby is shifting more toward what trophy are we playing for here? What trophy are we playing for here? And I'm trying to think about the last time the United States toured a country, and I want to say it was probably Wales in 2000. They might have done one after that. They did do Australia, I think 2 years before that, where they were playing like New South Wales country, or they playing. But I remember Wales. It was difficult. I think they played Wales A. They played Cross Keys Club, which was called early, and then they played Wales. They had a pretty good game against Wales. I personally see a value in that. I don't know if you see a value in that. I don't know if it really matters, because I don't know if are we ever going to see something like that again? Either United States touring a country where they don't always play test matches and don't always play for a trophy, or someone touring the United States and playing, an MLR All-Star team, and then something like that.
Yeah, listen, we've looked at those type of things, and I completely agree with you. The issue is obviously calendarization and access, not just for us, but when if you look at especially the old Welsh club system, that there were breaks and there were opportunities for those type of events to happen. And if you look at regions, I think potentially, which if you look at Southern Hemisphere opportunities, I think you are right. Continue to work with the MLR around what their long-term objectives are and supporting more American players. It's very difficult at the moment, as we know, as they're growing and expanding, but they do understand we had a meeting, myself and Alan Gilpin, they're invited to their board meeting in November, and talking about the long-term objectives. I mean, ultimately, if the MLR is going to reach the potential that it's going to reach, has to have more connectivity with US talent and US players as they come through that. They understand that. It's putting the systems and process in place that allow them to have a good product currently. But again, it comes back to what we talked about, which, one of Dan's major initiatives are, how does everyone buy into pushing as much talent, US talent, through to them as possible, and raising that before they get there as part of pathways and academies and structures, etc. So, if they stick with their February to June window, which I think they've looked long and hard at that last year. Due to COVID, it went a little bit late, but there's obviously the impact of the July release window, test match window, which is not great for them if that's around the end of the season. So we'll continue to work with them and develop that. But then you've got a period then, and I think that's, there are some potential opportunities for, a Moana Pacifica or whatever it is that, that are a Super Rugby franchise that comes for a few games against, as you say, more of that MLR All-Star USA Falcons team that does. And I think, but you've also got the same thing of potentially that entity going down to the Southern Hemisphere at that time to play those type of invitational games, which may be appealing. And it's all cost money, obviously, and that, how do you buy into it to allow that to happen? And if you look, and I can't remember whether we've talked about this before, but Japan making that jump from that developing nation into a tier one environment, a lot of that 2.5, 3 year build up beforehand with the Sunwolves, and then the Sunwolves not playing, but Japanese corporations, just because of the way rugby's put together in Japan, paying for that team to be together. And they toured Australia for 6 months as a team, a year and a bit out from the World Cup. That team was together as almost a super club team, as a national team, in a daily training environment for almost 2 years. But it took a shed load of money, but they played a lot of those games, say, under the radar, not technically international games as that touring side, but they also played a number of tier one teams during that period as teams came into Japan on their way up or down from the north and southern hemisphere, etc. So I think that everyone's aware of the recipe, Alex, but one of the big riders to that is the funding to be able to do it efficiently and effectively, and making sure that the balance of the players playing enough games. You say we're oldies. I remember being in France in 2007 with Fabien Pelouse, where Toulouse had won the French Championship, the European Cup, France Six Nations. He played something like 44 games in a year. That as a professional player welfare is hugely important. That's never going to happen again.
No, absolutely, and it's a problem. I remember Dave Hodges with the USA did very close to the same thing, and we do need to reduce the load on the players, and I think marketing sports. I'm laughing because we just finished the 17th game of the season for the NFL. They expanded it one game, but scarcity is what partly makes the NFL so successful.
Yeah.
And when I was a kid, the Five Nations was a huge thing because you didn't get to see the internationals that often. And then there was a tour, but not necessarily every year and not everyone. So we now in the UK, Australia, South Africa, New Zealand all come tour at the end of the year. Before it was like maybe New Zealand will come, maybe Australia will come. We don't know. Australia toured in '80, and then I think they toured again in '84. And because it was so rare, everybody wanted to see it, and everybody went to go see it. Now it's like ho hum, and so I think there's a marketing. I think you might agree, but there's a marketing benefit to cutting back. But if you cut back too far, right, you still need to play games, and you still need to, ideally make it a commercial success by having more games that are commercially successful.
Yeah, yeah, it's that, and building up that fan base. And you're right, the access to games, both you know both from a live environment. It's how things settle. I've been here 8 years. The opportunity to watch a game of rugby either on TV or live in the US was non-existent, as we all know. You're kicking around with VPNs and you do everything try and get access to games. Whereas now, there is more. The profile has raised, but it's some of those key ingredients that make for commercial success, are around certainty. And we've got this great new partner in Sport 5 that really trying to build some value proposition for us and get out there. Again, not in a great environment, but it's when you go and you pitch to a partner, well, what rights matrix do you have? Well, how many games are you going to be playing? When are you going to be playing? Who are you going to be playing them? And when you sit there at the moment, current, you go, well, we're hoping to do that. It's horrible, and it almost requires a leap of faith. And Medallia have been great partner because they sort of took that bit of a leap of faith for us during a difficult time. But EY were also great, but corporately they just had to take a different stance, as did UL previously. But both those came in because of almost ambassadorial support, or they had a cheerleader within their corporate organisation that saw the potential futures and benefits of rugby. But for us as an organisation currently, the tangible benefit of not knowing, what you're doing. Sevens is a little bit different, but World Rugby own a lot of those rights. Whereas from a 15s program, how are you going to activate? Where can you activate? How can you do it? And very difficult to build a value proposition around that level of uncertainty. But as you say, if we get that, when we're patient and we build it, there's undoubted opportunities.
It goes all the way down to the youngest players. That's the same question. How many games are you playing? Where are you playing them? Where do we practice? You have to have all those answers. And if you don't have answers, people are like, well, then why should I? I don't. You come back to me when you know all those answers, and then we'll talk. And you're saying, just to sort of wrap this up, have you executed a window shift because the United States is a Northern Hemisphere country with a Southern Hemisphere schedule? Have you established that it'll be more like August, September?
That's what we're planning for. So just pre-COVID, we'd had, and I think it was out there anyway, we'd almost had agreement in principle for that to be ratified, because that's one of those changes that have to be ratified by World Rugby Council, I think, or EXCO. So it was being prepared to be sort of rubber stamped, if you like. It never got to that because of what happened through COVID. So probably the meetings in May, we'll look to move that forward formally and get some structure around this. The competitions, which now in all likelihood are gonna, I would imagine the new structure and competition is probably going to form part of the warm up to the 2003 World Cup in France, with the first time we get off on the environment, because it's going to give all those teams the opportunity to play those type of games that they're all going to need in that window pre France.
2023. No.
2023.
Do you have to do this in conjunction with Canada because they have the same problems?
Well, technically not, but yes, we want to. I mean, part of what we've said from the start is, and Canada, has had very similar issues than we have, plus a few more they've had to deal with. And they started their restructuring before we did, and that in itself, as everyone's aware, has had a number of ongoing issues with Canada. But I think North America, when we look at North America as a whole, and Rugby America's North as that sort of support mechanism regionally with the partners there, is that we've been very clear that we all need to work together to show a little bit of strength, rather than the US going and doing something, Canada doing something else, and Iran and the Caribbean islands and Mexico, etc., kicking around doing their own thing. We need to be more integrated in what we're doing, use some economies of scale in resource, and then that gives us a little bit more clout at the table when, if you look at the way the structures are within World Rugby, that gives us, a bit more voting clout than if we're doing things individually on our own.
All right. And we've been talking a lot about national teams, and we did mention briefly sevens. Were you coming out of the Olympics, disappointed not to finish higher? I mean, I'm not one of those people who thinks, win a medal or you're nothing, because often, you look at the sheer volume of people or teams trying to get there. It's really difficult, you're supposed. But sixth wasn't great, and I think people had expectations a little higher.
Yeah, again, we're not saying anything. I think both coaches, the sets of players, everyone had a hope that with the two teams there that we would have kicked on, and of course it's disappointing, and especially for a lot of those athletes that went through with postponement, and they were both senior teams. And you can just see, what's happened with personnel-wise in both teams. That was always going to be a refresh point to rebuild again for both programs. Tokyo, and hanging on for another year and not playing any tournaments at all just made it a little bit more lottery-esque in how it was going to operate. And definitely on the the women's side and Team GB is an unknown quantity, that they'd only played those games against us in LA, that we'd look by far the better team, and of course we come up to them in that key knockout game, and we're the only team they really know, because they've analysed those games to the absolute minutiae. So it's Alex, I think everyone was gutted, but I think if you look at the events that have happened since then, on both programs, there's some really good, exciting new young talent coming through, and we have to move quickly. With Emily taking on the role of the women's side, which I think's phenomenal, and we had a really good candidate and it ran a really exhaustive process to a candidate list, and an exhaustive process that Emily came out on top of. And I think her and Mike, and Mike's roles altered a little bit now that he has this sort of technical advisor type status attached to his, to allow to build more continuity, build more American coaches supporting both programs. You've got Zach Tess, Ben Pinkelman involved in both of those now. It's the Zach on the women's side, Ben on the men's side is I think it's exciting times for both those programs, and they're going to work together. And I think more than they ever have in the past, between the men's and women's programs, with regard to resource and crossover, and hopefully that keeps us very much in the in the hunt for titles and medals, both on the men's and women's sides of those programs.
I think it's fair to say Mike Friday and Chris Brown, they were often looking ahead. There would be a player or two players on the squad at some event with, it's like, who's this player? 18 years old or whatever, and just giving them a taste, and said, yeah, look, there are people who aren't playing on the circuit but are still in training, and we're grooming them to come in. So I mean, they're still doing that. they're still looking, not just next week.
Yeah. You've got and I think the we're in a good shape with both of those. I think the men, will continue, and it's been beneficial so far. But there's going to be continued challenges now because the sevens is not the only option for domestic pro contracts. So there is going to be a little bit more tension looking for the young talent that you talked about with the opportunity of playing regularly within the MLR, or sitting on the bench or training at Chula Vista with. So that's another balance that today, relationship wise, has been great with people like Harley and Christian previously that have opportunities in both those areas. So
but if you're on the sevens team, you're only competing with Americans.
Correct.
And on an MLR team, you're competing with somebody from any corner of the globe, and I don't even remember what their foreigner limits are, but they're as good as non-existent.
I wouldn't say that. There's the thing that comes back to your North American concept, Alex, because Canadians and Americans, you can't really differentiate between them pretty much as you couldn't with Europeans in the old Premiership in the UK. So, Canadians not really accounted as a foreigner within the MLR because it's a North American competition. So, the limit of 10, if you like, within a squad that you're going to need now of 30 odd players, it's still technically only a third foreigners, and they've been good at sticking to that. So, but you're right, it has to come down at some point, as it did in the old days of the Premiership many moons ago when I was involved at Queen's. When it first started, there were a lot more Southern Hemisphere players around, but after a couple of years, the undertaking was to get that down. I think it was 6 at one point in your squad. And then, it's obviously been significantly reduced since then as well.
So that concludes part 1 of our interview with Ross Young, USA Rugby CEO. Part 2 will come up shortly. And we want to thank the support of the US Rugby Foundation and all the work that they do in growing grassroots rugby. And we help them let you know about the great work that they do. So thanks a lot to the US Rugby Foundation and also to Next Phase Rugby, connecting young players with college rugby programs using the app, the Next Phase Rugby app. Go to nextphaserugby.com. Thank you also to our Patreon patrons and our anonymous donors who provide financial support for Goff Rugby Report and Rugby Matrix and the content that we produce. We want to thank you very much for that, because that helps us continue to do what we do. So see you next time for the second half. Thanks a lot.